In episode 6 of season 2 of Different Strokes, I talk to a very popular clinical psychologist who is on a mission to make mental health more accessible and more acceptable in our day-to-day conversations. And he does that one Twitter thread at a time. I talk to Omar Baza about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which can occur after experiencing or witnessing a terrifying incident or personal loss. I do want to add a caveat here that this podcast was recorded much before the second wave of COVID-19 went out of control. However, this discussion will still be quite useful for all of us who have been impacted by this pandemic in some way. We're going to start. I hope you have about half an hour, 40 minutes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Super. So I do want to start by asking you, so you're quite a Twitter heartthrob, by the way. I don't know if you know this.
No, what? Sorry?
You're quite a Twitter heartthrob. I don't know if you know this.
What does that mean, heartthrob?
You're quite a Twitter sensation. You're very popular.
Oh, thank you. I don't know if I'm popular per se, but
yes,
I do enjoy tweeting about mental health.
Right. You're being very modest now. Okay, I want to start by asking you about the ways you decode mental health on Twitter threads, right? How did you come about that idea?
It's something that I've always wanted to do since I started studying psychology, because I always thought that one of the main problems of psychology was the fact that it wasn't accessible to everyone.
Right.
So I've always wanted mental health to be accessible to more people, and Threads was one way to do that.
Okay. And you've also started your YouTube channel now. How's that going?
It's going well. To be honest, I wish I had more time for it. I don't release videos as frequently as I would like to, but I love doing it. It's a good project and a good format to experiment with, just because it also allows me to get out of my comfort zone, because I'm usually not very comfortable in front of a camera, so it helps.
Right. I hear you. It's the same with me, hence the podcast. So, okay. But you have a very tough job at hand as well. I'm sure, it's not easy to be, a psychologist to people who are dealing with very difficult mental health. And as a human being, and as their psychologist, you tend to take on a lot, right? How do you try to brush that off?
Yeah, I mean, it's not always the easiest, but at the same time, I think I have a good self-care routine, and I try to get a good night of sleep every night, and go on walks with my pets and all that in order to just kind of stay psychologically healthy, in order to be able to address all the concerns of my clients, and then also of people on Twitter that reach out to me.
Right. And okay, so I do want to ask you about the topic that I want to discuss with you, which is the post-traumatic stress disorder, because a lot of people that I interview, they've obviously been through a lot of trauma in life, and it's not always easy for everybody to come out of it, right? Unless you have a great support system. And like you mentioned, that mental health, experts are not accessible to everybody, because it's not affordable, and also because there's a lot of taboo attached, right? So how does one deal with PTSD, number one? And if you can explain it to our listeners in very simple terms, what PTSD means and how do you really deal with it?
Yeah, PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, is probably one of the most complicated forms of mental illness. And it's so prevalent in our culture because a lot of that trauma is woven into the fabric of our culture. When we look at arranged marriages and the sexism and all that is sort of accepted in our society, also leads to a lot of trauma.
Right.
And so I wouldn't be surprised if most of us coming from a brown culture have a form of trauma or another.
Yeah.
Either from, forms of manipulation, physical trauma, like from being hit, spanked by parents, manipulated by parents, and things like that. So it is quite complex. And usually, like I always tell people that, especially when it comes to anxiety and depression, that there are ways that we can cope with it. But trauma is so complicated that really, like, a trauma therapist and a trauma therapy is really important, because we're going back into events that happened decades ago sometimes.
Right.
Or we don't even realize that these are the events that have triggered the PTSD. So it's really important to go to therapy for that.
And what is the most appropriate way to identify PTSD? Because I for one, obviously I'm also from a Brown family, so I know that, when you try and discuss it with anybody in the family, they'll, their immediate response would be, "You're thinking too much." You're taking it too seriously. So they will try to brush it off because they obviously don't understand the gravity of the situation. So what are the simplest ways to identify PTSD? Can we do it on our own, or do you need an expert to do it for us? Because the first step obviously would be to start it at home, right? Somebody has to identify something is not right and then take you to an expert.
Yeah. I mean, there are signs, but it's going to be different from one person to another. So symptoms that we sometimes attribute to anxiety or depression,
right?
Like not having any motivation, not being able to get out of bed, or even some of the shaking, heart pounding, shortness of breath that happens with anxiety can also be attributed to PTSD.
Right.
So rather than looking at specific symptoms, I would say look at your quality of life. Are you happy? Are you feeling satisfied? Is there something that's stopping you from being happy? If yes, then you need help, without like throwing any labels of PTSD, anxiety, depression.
Right.
If you feel that you're not living the best quality of life that you can, just go find out, like, with a professional what it can be.
Okay, that's a good thing that you're saying, but it makes me think about procrastination as well then. So is there a difference between what the symptoms that you're suggesting and between procrastination?
I mean, procrastination is always almost always a symptom of our mental health not doing well.
Right. Okay.
Because our brains have a limited amount of energy. And in an ideal situation, we choose where that energy goes. But when our mental health is not doing well, then most of that energy is going towards our thoughts, towards those symptoms of mental health issues. And it leaves us with very limited amount of energy that we can then use throughout the day. And that leads to a lot of procrastination.
Right. Okay, so it's a sort of interconnected symptom. It's I would say it's a vicious cycle then. One thing is linked to the other and then to the other.
Yeah, and the same goes for memory, attention span, focus, everything that's related with our brain performance.
Okay. And what would be the most common myths related to post-traumatic stress disorder?
The most common, sorry?
Myth.
Oh, myths.
Yeah.
That the person, flashbacks, like when we look at movies, we tend to see people who have flashbacks, and that's like sort of their trauma. While flashbacks can be common in post-traumatic stress disorder, they're not always there, because sometimes our brain represses that traumatic event, and so it doesn't surface at all, but still creates problems.
Okay. And can PTSD hamper our normal day-to-day functioning?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And all mental health issues will impact our day-to-day life, no matter what they are.
Okay. So if I were to ask you that, is it, I've seen a lot of people brush things aside, right? That, time is a great healer and things are going to, take their own course, etc. And it's going to be okay if you give it time and so on and so forth. Of course, such advice is very common. How true do you think it is in case of PTSD? Does that really help? I mean, when you let
things take their own course and you let things be for a while and give it time, you might tend to feel better. But does that necessarily mean that you're over PTSD?
No, absolutely not. What it does, though, is that it teaches us to bury it down even more. It also teaches us to put on a mask and master having that mask on when we're in public or at work or with other people. It can also solidify some bad coping mechanisms to get rid of that PTSD, like using substances.
Right.
But without a proactive treatment, the PTSD is going to be there.
Right. And I've also heard a lot of people say that, why don't you get busy? Such advice is also common when they say that. Why don't you get busy? Why don't you do things that you like? When you're occupied, you're not thinking about those things. Does that really help? Or is it like brushing things under the carpet?
Yeah. In the short term, it may help.
Okay.
In the long term, it doesn't, though, because it's a form of repressing the issue. So essentially what people are saying is stay busy so that you don't think about it. And
right.
It's not crossing your mind. But what we're doing then is like repressing it even more.
Right.
And so it becomes a bigger challenge to treat it later on.
Right. And what advice would you give to the caregivers? Because obviously PTSD is not going to impact only the victim, but also the people around them, right? So what advice would you give to the caregivers?
So for caregivers, the main thing I would say is take care of your mental health first. By being a caregiver, you can sacrifice your own life and your own well-being to take care of someone else. Because then your mental health is also going to suffer, and then we're going to have two people that need therapy as opposed to the original one person. So as a caregiver, you also have limitations. You cannot start controlling the person that you're helping or manipulating them into doing behaviors that you like. So the person who is suffering is still the one who is in control of their own mental health, in control of what they want to do. And it can be easy to just think that they would get better if we took control, but it ends up backfiring. So let the person who is suffering dictate how they want to be helped, as opposed to you forcing yourself on in terms of helping them the way you want to.
Right. Omar, I've also seen this very peculiar behavior in people who refuse to get any help because they're very stubborn about it or dismissive about the fact that nothing can happen with them, So how do you really put any logic into their head? How do you make them explain that, you really might need help?
There is not much we can do. I mean, we can give them some reading material. We can encourage them to research more about mental health. We can even encourage them to talk to people who have been in therapy or who have taken medications for their mental health, so that they remove some of that stigma and some of those myths that are around mental health. But at the end of the day, it's within their hands. They're the ones who choose whether they want to go to treatment or not.
Right.
And it's important to remember that the more we pressure or try to force someone to go to treatment, the more likely they are to be turned off by that idea and never actually go.
I agree.
So giving them that space is also really important.
Yeah. It's a chicken and egg situation. Okay, I do want to ask you about children because, sometimes children are also at the receiving end and they've also probably they're harboring a traumatic incident. How do you deal with children in such scenarios? Obviously, the mechanism or the therapy, the treatments might be different for them, but what can parents do to really help their child come out of that traumatic episode?
Yeah, absolutely. And it depends on where the trauma is coming from. I would say most of the time it's coming from parents. So if you want to help your kid, you need to change.
Right.
And change the way that you operate, change your parenting style. Even go to therapy yourself if you have some unresolved trauma as a parent, in order to prevent future episodes of trauma from happening. The second thing would be to take your kid to a child psychologist who's going to be able to help your child deal with that trauma through a form of therapy that is appropriate for a kid that age. So, for example, for kids who are usually younger than 10 years old, we use a lot of play therapy.
Right.
And that's more helpful than having a kid just sit down for an hour and talk, because that's not really how they operate at that age.
But if you say that the parents are the triggers and they are the ones who are supposed to take their children to therapy, how is that going to work? Because who's going to bell the cat?
Who's going to tell?
Who's going to bell the cat? Who's going to tell the parents that you are probably the trigger who's causing all the trauma to your child? That's not going to be an easy conversation to have.
No, it's not. And it's very difficult because we need to, we can't be too accusatory with parents.
Yeah.
Because then they're going to be defensive and never actually seek therapy again.
Yes.
So we have to really, really be diplomatic when we approach this topic and sort of remove as much of the guilt as possible from the parents so that they're encouraged to continue with therapy, because it can feel almost cathartic to just tell parents like what you've been doing is completely wrong.
Yeah.
You've traumatized your child and you need to change immediately.
Oh, I agree.
But taking that course will be so counterproductive that it's not going to work at all.
You're right. Is there an expiry date to PTSD? Does it ever end?
Yes and no. The trauma itself, like the symptoms of PTSD, the disorder itself, can be treated. Does the trauma leave completely? No. We learn to live with it and we can be happy, live a fulfilling, happy life. At times it may surface a little bit again, but after we've gone through therapy, we're able to cope with it and we're able to rationalize it,
right,
so that it doesn't impact us. It's something that we're going to have to live with because, we haven't yet invented a machine that can erase memories or certain specific memories. Okay,
that's a good thing. Finally, I want to ask you about what you're doing. I think is a phenomenal endeavor, especially through social media. You're using that platform very wisely, and a lot of people are really looking up to your inspiring threads. But do you think as a society we are ready to talk about mental health? Are things changing?
Yeah, they are actually. And especially with our generations, like millennials, Gen X, I think we're really trying to break from the traditions of our parents, grandparents, etc. Really trying to change the way that we view happiness, the way that we view equality and equity. And I definitely have a lot of hope and optimism in removing a lot of those stigmatizing behaviors and beliefs from our culture. And it's something that keeps me going. Right.
Do you also work with the Gen X? The older generation of parents and grandparents, do you work with them also?
Not as often, but I do work with them.
Right.
There are great people out there from all generations who actually want to change, who actually want to get better, even when they're older. And it's always encouraging because, we need that stigma to be removed, and we need people to get better because that creates a more empathetic society.
Right. And do you find a difference in in their approach to mental health as compared to the millennials and the Gen Z?
They are more. It's hard to generalize like an age group.
I'm sure.
But maybe they take more time to open up, especially about certain topics that may be more taboo, like sexuality and things like that. Whereas, like, I have millennials and Gen X who open a first therapy session with that, which is frankly amazing because you want the person to feel comfortable and safe opening up about any topic, because therapy is not supposed to have any taboos.
Absolutely, I agree. Thank you so much for taking the time, Omar. It's been amazing to have this conversation with you, and I hope to bring you on Different Strokes once again, maybe for something more relevant to mental health, because the more conversations we have, I think the better it is. The more people can hear us and get help and live a fulfilling life.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk about mental health and hopefully improving the way we view mental health in our culture.
Yes, you're doing something phenomenal out there, so don't stop.
Oh, thank you. That's very sweet.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.